Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at the Women's University Club in Seattle is Daniel James Brown, author of The Boys in the Boat. Daniel, thanks so much for coming by today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nancy.
Spending your afternoon with us here.
That wouldn't be anyplace else.
How did you come up with this story that you wanted to base your third book on?
This is a story that it literally walked into my living room one day about 6 years ago in the person of my neighbor, a lady I knew only as Judy at the time. Judy had been reading one of my earlier books to her father, and he was in hospice care at her home. He was enjoying that earlier book, and he wanted to meet me, and so she asked me if I'd come down and chat with him. And so I don't remember if it was the next day or the day after that, I went down and I met a gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was in his late 90s, and he was on oxygen, but he was very bright-minded, very clear and articulate. And he began to talk to me. We talked a little bit about that earlier book, and then he began to tell me about his very poignant story of growing up during the Depression. He, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but he had a very hard time in the Depression. He was basically abandoned by his parents at a very young age during the Depression, and that caused him all kinds of difficulty. And then he began to talk about how he had begun to row on the crew at the University of Washington in 1933, and how ultimately he had wound up rowing with his crewmates representing the United States in Berlin in 1936, rowing for the gold medal against, amongst others, a German boat, and rowing in front of Hitler and Goebbels and Goering and all the top Nazis. And as he began to tell me this story, as he told me this story, I was just absolutely mesmerized by it.
Did you get goosebumps?
I did. I got goosebumps, and I knew right away it was a great story. And I also noticed that as he told me this story, whenever he began to talk about any of the other boys who had rowed with him, he would tear up. And that became quite conspicuous after a while. Anyway, at the end of the conversation, I just asked him flat out. I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And he paused a moment and he shook his head and he said, no, I don't want you to write a book about my life, but you can write a book about the boat. And at first I didn't know what he meant. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful George Pocock built cedar shell that he and his crewmates had raced in. But then he gave me to understand that what he meant by that was more than that. It was the other boys in the boat, and even more than that, it was this almost perfect thing that they had become together 75 years before that summer in Berlin. It was very important to Joe that the book be about what they had all done together. And so I started the next day, basically. I set out to write the book in that spirit.
Did you start by doing other research or to re-interview Joe Rance or what?
I was right in the middle. I was nearing the finish line with another book. So I was simultaneously working on that previous book, that other book, and then I began to interview Joe and sort of juggling the two things together. Because Joe was in the last few weeks of his life, I wanted to get as much of his story as I could. So I wound up doing both for a while, but basically I wanted to capture Joe's story before I began to do the other kinds of research I knew I would need to do. And then I went on to interview the family members of the other 8 fellows in the boat over the course of the next couple of years. All these families of these 9, there's 8 oarsmen and 1 coxswain in the boat. So all 9 families had been sitting on this story for 75 years. And they were all extremely excited when they discovered somebody was going to write a book about it. So they came to me with box loads of photographs and diaries and letters and news clippings and just this wonderful treasure trove of material. And somebody from each family sat down with me and gave me many, many hours of interview about their father or grandfather, as the case might be. So I was very blessed by having the cooperation of so many people that were close to the story.
Mm-hmm. So with so much information at hand that you had accumulated from the relatives and of these 9 boys, how did you keep to the through line?
Was I sat down partway through the process and I wrote a synopsis of the entire story. But it wasn't, the usual book synopsis is like a page or a page and a half. And this was actually turned out to be a 17-page synopsis, wow. Which is hardly a synopsis. But the exercise forced me to conceive of the beginning, the middle, and the end, and to understand the arc of the story, the climax of the story, the resolution of the story.
How did you become interested in narrative nonfiction, what we call these days narrative nonfiction?
Well, I've always read a lot of narrative nonfiction. I'm a big fan of people like Tim Egan and David Laskin and Laura Hillenbrand. I love that kind of writing. So it's what I've tended to read for the last 10 or 15 years, for one thing. And the other thing is I started writing, the first book I wrote was called Under a Flaming Sky. And I started writing that when I came across a box of newspaper clippings and letters my mother had stored in the attic. It was about a forest fire in which my great-grandfather had died, and in which my grandfather and his mother escaped on a burning train. And so I dug into this box of materials, and I thought the story was great. And so the way I thought best to do that was, rather than just a dry history of the fire, I wanted to write it in a novelistic style, which is basically what narrative nonfiction is. It's writing nonfiction in a novelistic style. So that first project sort of taught me how to approach a topic, and that seemed to work out for me.
And how did you then go about choosing the subject, the Donner Party, for your next book? And how long did it take in between?
I had just finished the previous book when my editor, then at HarperCollins, immediately asked me what was next. And I wrote her a one-page email synopsis of the story that had been in my head about the Donner Party, and boom, we had a book. So it unfolded quite quickly. But that book also, there was kind of a family connection to it. My great uncle, who was a very young man, 16, and his father had been amongst those. Actually, they had led the first rescue expedition up into the Sierra Nevada in the spring of 1847 to reach the Donner Party and start bringing people out. So I had always had this family connection with that story. And then when I dove into it, I just decided it wasn't my own family's connection that was most interesting to me, but the story of a young woman named Sarah Fosdick Graves, who was one of several relatively young, healthy people who hiked out of the Sierra Nevada that winter and got word out to the rest of the world of what had happened up in the High Sierra. So again, it was a family connection kind of thing that got me going.
I imagine you're in the process of trying to figure out what to do next.
I am.
And what is that like?
That's agonizing, basically. The problem is, or the issue is, that it takes 4 or 5 years for me to write one of these books. And if you're going to spend 4 or 5 years on a topic, literally every day, because when I'm working on a book, I'm thinking about it, if not writing, 7 days a week for the whole time. So if you're going to spend that much time with a topic, you really have to love it.
Right.
And so I'm looking for story ideas. I'm getting people who have been sending me sheaves of paper about grandpa or grandma. And I haven't had time to look through all those materials yet. I'm hoping to find something good there.
You read American history. You're fond of American history.
I read everything from popular history to very academic history. When I was writing this book about this University of Washington crew, the boys in the boat, one of the threads of the narrative is what was happening in Germany during 1933 through 36. I wanted to know what was unfolding in the new Nazi state there. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time reading academic histories of the rise of the Nazis. Even though I knew I was only going to use a tiny fraction of what I was learning, I wanted to have a comprehensive sense of the history that was going on in Germany.
I could imagine reading the history to look for that kind of idea, something that hasn't been explored so much that you can
Sure.
Then...
I love the whole process of researching a book because even though I had that 17-page synopsis and the arc of the story, I knew I would find things along the way that would enrich it. And so I would take things out of that synopsis and put other things in as the research process went on. So for me, it's always been a kind of iterative process, the writing and the research. I get a sense of the overall arc of the story, but then as I start writing each scene or a chapter, I'm also researching as I go along, and so I find interesting things that I need to add along the way.
When did you see the video that Leni Riefenstahl did of the race? Early on?
I didn't see it early on. I saw it relatively late in the writing, and I was glad to see that the film matched my understanding of what was happening. Leni Riefenstahl's film, it's just one clip from a much longer film called Olympia that was part of the Nazi propaganda, of course, surrounding the 1936 games. And, you know, Riefenstahl's a very complex topic. She has, to this day, she has defenders because she was a great artist. But it's also become increasingly clear, particularly in recent years, that she was very much serving the interests of the Nazi state. And that film is very much a deliberate piece of propaganda.
Were you a rower?
I was not a rower, and I'm still not a rower. Rowing is brutal stuff. I was very concerned about that when that very day I met Joe. One of the things I was wrestling with in my mind is, how are you going to write a book about rowing if you're not a rower? And so I got a lot of help from the folks down at the University of Washington Shell House, the coaches and the young men and women both down there who row, and other rowers that I came to know in the process of writing the book. And they read various drafts of the manuscript. And I learned a ton about rowing along the way. And I've really been gratified as I've gone around the country talking about the book, is that so far the rowers seem to be saying that I got it right. So that's very gratifying.
When I was reading this, I was thinking of other team sports, baseball, football, hockey, whatever, but it seems that there's something a little bit special about the act of rowing in like an 8-man, 9-man boat.
I don't think there's anything quite like it in the world of sport or perhaps anywhere else. In terms of the degree of cooperation and synchronization and trust that are involved. When you're rowing an 8, particularly at the level we're talking about, a national championship or an Olympic gold medal, every blade of every oar has to enter the water at precisely the same moment, at just the right angle, be pulled with just the right amount of strength, and so on and so forth. All these very small details of movement have to be synchronized. But more than that, the psychology of the 9 people in the boat, they all have to be aligned and they all have to be working together. And so there's this enormous element of trust that goes into building a championship crew. And that's actually a really important part of the story, partly because Joe Rance, who's the thread that holds the story together, because he was abandoned as a young man, grew up not trusting anybody. Mm-hmm. And in order to become successful at crew, he had to learn to overcome that, to start trusting the other boys in the boat. And that really becomes sort of the tension at the center of the book, of whether he can or can't reach that level of trust and become as good as he was capable of becoming.
So in some ways, it's also a coming-of-age story.
Yeah.
And overcoming the past.
Rowing is really the stage on which there is this very personal story, coming of age of this one young man. As much as I wanted the book to be about all the boys together, and I think it is, there is also definitely this very personal story of this one young man at the heart of it. And I think calling it a coming of age story is absolutely right.
I have to say, before I read this book, I never knew that the U.S. had won the gold medal.
The Jesse Owens story, I think, rightly eclipsed all other stories about the Olympics in 1936. It's a great story. It's a great American story. And it's a great story partly because it's one of those stories that reminds us who we are as a people. It reminds us that we value certain things like fairness and equality. And so I think that story tended to eclipse all other stories that summer. The other interesting thing is that the Jesse Owens story is a story about a great individual achievement. And to my mind, this story about these boys in this boat is also a great American story. It's a story about what we can do when we come together and literally pull as one, when we climb into a boat and learn to pull together. For me, the book really, the story is a kind of metaphor for what that generation of Americans did when they confronted the Depression and the necessity of winning World War II. They found a way to come together and to pull together and to accomplish great things by trusting one another. You know, I think it's partly they learned humility. They learned humility because of the suffering they endured in the Depression. They learned there were forces in the world more powerful than they were. And that humility, I'm speaking now of the whole generation, or as representatives of the generation, they learned through their humility, they learned to trust one another. And so for me, as I say, the story of these 9 boys in some ways just encapsulates what so many Americans did in that generation.
Do you want to revisit that generation in other books?
I'm tempted to. I mean, it's hard when you write about them not to want to come back to them. One of the things that first meeting I had with Joe, one of the reasons his story really resonated with me was that my own father was of the exact same generation, born I think the same year that Joe was. My own father his father died right at the beginning of the Depression in 1929. So he was 14 years old, the same age that Joe was when he was abandoned. And he had to give up he was hoping to go to law school, and he was unable to do that because of the ravages of the Depression. So I immediately empathized with Joe because his story was so much like my father's. And so much I have found talking to people who've read the book about so much like the story of their fathers, my readers' fathers and mothers, that it's very hard not to want to spend more time with that generation. If I do write another 30s book, then I would like to find a different angle on it to keep it fresh, of course.
Were you always drawn to nonfiction as a young reader?
Actually, as a young reader, no, I read mostly fiction. I mean, I was an English major in college, and so like all English majors, I read all the great novels and the classics, and I still read a lot of fiction. But in terms of my own personal style and what fulfills me, I think that I'm going to stay away from fiction. It's hard to be constrained by the facts, you know. I mean, there are times when you wish that the facts turned out differently than they did. And there are times when you long for the freedom that a novelist has to just go in whatever direction would make a great story. But on the other hand, there's a certain amount of comfort in the fact that the story does exist, and you don't have to invent a plot. The story's there. Your job is to tell it well and to unearth the essential elements of it that will be meaningful to a reader. So on the whole, I think I'm happier writing nonfiction.
I'm thinking of Robert Frost's quote about free verse, which he despised, basically. And he said writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net. And in some ways, that's what nonfiction
Yes.
is, playing tennis with a net.
With a net, right. The net is always there, and,
Right.
and the ball's got to get over it. And, there are definitely times when you would prefer that things were different than they are. But a good story is a good story. And there are plenty of good nonfiction stories out there to work with. The trick's just finding them.
I was thinking also when I was reading this, if this were fiction, it would be a totally unbelievable story.
Right.
I mean, it'd be one of the things that said, "Oh, come on,"
Right.
that kind of thing.
That's right. And I was thinking that when I do look for a new topic, one of the things I like to look for is some element of improbability in that topic. I think that in all my books, if you look at them, there's something about the story that was improbable. And if you can find a true story that has an element of improbability, I think you're not guaranteed success, because there's a lot of work to do to write the book well. But it's a big step forward in terms of finding an interesting story, if there's something unlikely at work in the story.
How much research did you do looking at old newspapers from UW? I mean, did you make use of the great archival collection that the library has?
Yeah, I spent probably 100 hours or more in Suzzallo Library on the University of Washington campus, hunched over microfiche readers, reading newspaper clippings newspapers from the 1930s. And it's interesting, I didn't just read this coverage of the races. I discovered early on that one of the things I wanted to do was bring alive Seattle during the Depression as the setting for this book. And so I found that after I read the sports columns about the crew, I would often linger and read the whole paper for a given day, often just some arbitrary day in 1933 or 34. Just sort of read the paper from cover to cover to see what all was going on in Seattle in 1934. What movies were playing at the local theaters, what the other cultural events that were going on, there were great labor disputes going on through all these years down on the waterfront here in Seattle. And so just sort of taking Depression era of Seattle into my head, even though, again, I knew I wouldn't use 99% of that material, I found it really helpful when I did sit down to write the story. Having a detailed knowledge of the setting helped allow me to bring it to life.
When they did win the gold at the Olympics, were there headlines in the papers here?
It's kind of a tragedy, actually. Royal Brougham, the great Seattle sports writer, was in Berlin, and immediately after the race sat down and wrote a 7 or 8 page detailed account of the race and wired it back to Seattle. And the sports writers at the PI had gone on strike that morning. And his story never did get published. As far as I know, it's never been published. And then the boys, they didn't all come home at once and have a ticker tape parade here, as they had when they beat California the year before. There was literally a ticker tape parade up First Avenue in Seattle. There was nothing like that when they won the gold medal in Berlin. They came home in dribs and drabs and immediately set about trying to find jobs, because it was still the Depression, and they still had the problem ahead of them getting through another year of school. So they went about, mostly they put their gold medals in sock drawers and went back to work, and to a large extent the story just sort of fell by the wayside.
And do the families still have those
Yes.
9 gold medals?
Yeah, well, there's various tales about the gold medals and their fate. Joe's was interesting. Joe's gold medal, he brought home and put in a sock drawer or something, and then years later, when Judy was an adult, they went looking for the gold medal and they couldn't find it anywhere, and they gave it up for lost. And many more years passed, and they decided to put a new roof on the house. And in the attic, in some insulation material, they found the gold medal. And apparently a squirrel or a rodent of some kind had taken a liking to it. There was a little nest there, and the gold medal was in the nest. And so it is now on Judy's display case in her.
Is there one one episode or one aspect that you wish that you had been able to include but had to be edited out, or you couldn't quite fit it in?
Because this was Berlin in the mid-1930s, I did an enormous amount of research about the Holocaust. Even though the Holocaust really hadn't unfolded yet, the groundwork was being laid. Dachau was being built that summer. And so I spent weeks and weeks researching various aspects of how the beginnings of the Holocaust were beginning to unfold in Berlin. And in particular in the little village where these guys were quartered during the games. And I wrote quite a bit about that, that ultimately we had to cut out of the book, because as interesting as it was and as heartrending as it was, it just didn't really contribute to the narrative. So, having touched the Holocaust even a little bit in this book, it's hard. This is another problem I'm having as I try to figure out a next topic. That is such an overwhelming story. It's hard to see any historical story as matching it in significance. So that's always in my mind too. I think there's a million great Holocaust stories to be told still.
Were any of the boys Jewish? Did any of them have that sense that they were doing something?
By and large, I should start off by saying that, like most Americans that summer that they went there, they were not very interested in what was happening in Germany. They didn't want America involved in European affairs. But one boy, the coxswain, Bobby Mack, while they were in New York at the Olympic training facility, they're getting ready to go to Berlin, he wrote to his father back in Seattle and asked if he could have the address of their relatives in Germany and Switzerland, because he wanted to visit them while he was over there. And a couple weeks later, or I suppose it was more like 10 days later, he got a letter from his father, and he opened the envelope, and inside there was another envelope, and on the front of that envelope it said, "Open this in a private place." So Bobby Mack took it out in a field and sat under a tree and opened this letter, and in the letter his father told him that his family heritage was Jewish, something Bobby had never been told before. And Bobby started crying by his own account. And he wasn't crying because he was Jewish.
Right.
He was crying because he realized his father had felt it necessary to keep this from all their friends and associates and neighbors and even his own family, even in America. And we forget that there was still a lot of anti-Semitism in the U.S. in the 1930s. So Bobby Mack discovered just before he went to Berlin that he was his heritage was Jewish, and that was pretty amazing. But the fact is nobody really knew yet what was coming. So if it had been 10 years later, it would have been entirely different.
Daniel, I feel like we could go on talking for many other half an hour shows, but I think we have to wrap it up. And I just want to thank you again for doing this. It's just a wonderful book, and I have to say I'm just looking forward to your next book.
Great. Well, thank you.
Whatever it may be.
Yeah, whatever it may be.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks.